Hello, everyone. My name is Maggie Vandenberg with the IQ Business Group. I'm happy to be your moderator for today's webinar, Assessing Risk, How to Protect Your Most Valuable Data. I'm joined today by Ryan Britton, Vice President of Delivery from Mint, and Jay Hall, Channel Solution Engineer from Apppoint, and Brian Vanetten, Solution Engineering Manager from Apppoint. We are proud to sponsor today's webinar to support our public and private sector folks, including Fed, SLED, and our private sector friends seeking knowledge and insight for leveraging Microsoft 365 to improve compliance and reduce their liability. For folks who have joined us before, thanks for joining us again. And for those we haven't had the pleasure of meeting before, welcome. IQBG is a leading provider of records and information management solutions for the public sector and highly regulated industries. Since 2008, the IQ Business Group has been developing ECRM and content services solutions for highly regulated industries, including public and private sectors, that leverage people, process, and technology to support your requirements.
Hey everyone, welcome to another webinar Wednesday. I'm Ryan Britton here from the Mint Group. Mint is a global Microsoft solution provider with a 20-year history of success implementing solutions on Microsoft technologies. We have a long list of gold competencies that we maintain across the group of businesses. We're active in 5 territories, and we focus on highly regulated industries.
Brian, you're muted.
Or Jay, can you speak to this? Okay, if not, I'll go ahead and jump in. So hey everybody, Brian Vanetten, manager of the solutions engineering team here at Apppoint, and I've been working at Apppoint now for 6 years. However, Apppoint has been in the migration management and protection of SharePoint and M365 content since 2001. So we go all the way back to the original versions of SharePoint. We, however, do much more than that in the cloud these days. And so we are a global organization on 6 of the 7 continents with customers around the world, again, helping organizations migrate, manage, and protect their SharePoint and M365 data.
Great. So the 3 organizations that are represented here today, Mint, the IQ Business Group, and Halfpoint, together we do consulting around smart compliance, which is a set of disciplines that have to do with the implementation and maintenance of information governance and compliance solutions. And it's from the experiences of these implementations that we bring you some insights into our topic today. The information landscape itself is very diverse, and smart compliance covers most of what we see organizations wrestle with as they try to bring to bear a good information strategy in today's day and age. There's a lot of things that you have to consider about physical records, how to implement information architecture on top of that, how to govern your cloud or hybrid tenants, using solid policies that are enforceable at all levels, how to collaborate with collaborators that might be in different tenants, partners, vendors, and the like, how to protect your information and stop it from leaving your tenant, how to secure not only your immediate environments, but now work from home environments, as well as devices that may belong to your employee, may belong to personal devices belonging to employees and not just company devices. And on top of that, there's a whole suite of things that we're seeing folks struggle with inside of the information space, whether it is about digitizing documents or staying compliant with evolving regulations across the globe, managing risk, developing a solid information strategy, migrating, putting in place technologies for backup, archiving, governance, those types of things.
And to start things off, we have a poll for y'all. We want to know a little bit about where you think your data risk lies. So do you think about compliance issues, like what if you get fined for not meeting regulations? Are you worried about hacks? We've been seeing a lot of those lately. So that should be up on your screen. Go ahead and vote. Okay, almost everybody's voted now. 17% are concerned about their compliance liability and fines. 58% are concerned about cybersecurity. I think that's unsurprising. And 25% are worried about data loss.
That's interesting. Ryan, Jay, and myself were all talking about this poll question. In particular, we're curious to see where this audience would land. Jay or Ryan, do you have any thoughts about the poll results?
You know, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes,
Ryan?
we can. Confirmed.
Awesome.
Yeah,
So,
you're good, Jay.
yeah, I think the interesting thing here, right, is that from my perspective and a lot of the customers and partners that I've spoken to and talked with, data loss is usually the thing that we find is the biggest concern. Um, Generally speaking, everyone knows that in some way, shape, or form, they need a duplicate copy of data, right? What happens when your cloud services goes down, or even just a server that you're working on, right? Making sure that you're able to stand back up in a very quick situation is very important. So it's definitely interesting that cybersecurity is the one that won here.
I mean, I do think it is a scary minefield, especially when you consider that you can have the best technologies implemented, and you're still vulnerable to social engineering. You know, we're at a point where organizations have to invest in making sure that every person who's employed within that organization understands their responsibility and how to handle and manage information, and interact with it in a responsible way.
That's right. And then building on top of the cybersecurity mindset, it's, defense in depth. It's not just the applications and security settings put in place for the business. It's also about advocating and working with your end users to understand their responsibility as well. So it's a multi-layered, multifaceted approach. And I'm sure we'll be talking more about this as we go through these slides.
Yeah, good point.
All right, let's get going.
Okay, so we thought it might be a good idea to start with the question, why do we care about risk? Hopefully it's obvious to everybody, but just to kind of set the scene as we start to get out of the starting gates here. I think that everybody could agree that in most situations inside of business, the process of making a successful business is about weighing risk, identifying opportunity, and managing the process, the balancing act that happens in the middle, which would be good business. And even in public sector, being able to take the opportunity to roll out a new system for citizens involves an element of risk. And we really can't pursue an opportunity without absorbing, acknowledging, managing some of that risk. And so as we're talking about how to manage risk, a lot of what represents risk these days when we're talking about the types of opportunities we're pursuing is IT related, is information related, and is really something that needs to be taken into consideration very seriously at the beginning of every project.
Yeah, for sure. And also balancing that real quick, Ryan, is security versus usability, right? But we'll get more into that.
Yeah. Okay, so a few things here. What we wanted to try and convey from a messaging perspective on this slide was just some of the macroeconomic trends that we're seeing and what that portends to the greater picture, if you will. What do the individual pieces of the tapestry show about what's happening in the larger work of art, as it were? And what we're seeing is that from an information privacy perspective, and I'm sure most of the folks on the call would have seen this as well. There are numerous regulations, international mandates, statewide decrees that have to do with protecting consumer rights and privacy. Organizations are having to adhere to this, but this is being pushed forward by industry, by different countries, even where their citizens may be customers of organizations in another country. And it's certainly a very interesting space. Things like personalization, which is in the media a lot these days, talking about the misuse of people's information and organizations who try to accrue as much data about folks as they can, and then use that in order to give them a better chance of being able to market and sell to them and to predict their activities and so forth. And I think that this is getting a lot of bad press, but it's certainly something to think about when you're thinking about what you are and are not able to do in terms of personalizing an experience using data that you're aggregating about people, which may be personally identifiable. And then managed services, regulations like GDPR, CCPA, LGPD, are all necessitating that organizations govern the use of their data, vendors and their partners and so forth as well. And what it means is that it's not just a responsibility to internally, and it's not just a responsibility to your customers, but you're also taking on the responsibility of your entire supply chain, since there is a liability in how information is managed if it is shared with vendors and partners who are part of your larger ecosystem. The broadening data ecosystem leads on from then that, and thinking about the fact that there's more types of data. Those types of data are stored in specific formats. There are petabytes of it that exist in the cloud these days, and so that data ecosystem becomes ever more complex and ever more onerous to maintain. And then finally, leading on from the popularity of cybersecurity in our poll, security breaches, data breaches that can result in loss of control of private and confidential information, loss of intellectual property, reputational damage, and a lot of other things that we're going to talk a little bit more about on future slides. But essentially, there's a lot going on in the world about information these days. Guys, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. Both the personalization aspect and the security breach, ones that we talk to customers about a lot when it comes to being able to help organizations better sift through information that is, personally identifiable not only to their employees but their customers. But then in the circumstance of a breach, how it's not an if, it's a when, and we talk more about this later. How do we go about ensuring that we mitigate that loss, or we report to the appropriate authorities or end users that something has happened, to do due diligence there as part of our responsibility if something goes wrong? And it's typically a when, not an if these days.
Yeah, and I have a favorite metaphor when it comes to that, and I'm sure that if folks on the call have attended our other webinars, they would have heard it previously. But I think at a point in time, it was relatively okay to be slack when it came to managing money and managing individual rands and cents. And at a point in time, that became unacceptable, and there were global, generally accepted accounting practices that specified what was expected from an organization in terms of the way that it manages its money and the way that it audits its management of that money, and being able to attest to that. And I think that what we're seeing is the same sort of thing happening from an informational perspective. It's no longer okay to say, well, we don't know what information we have and it grows organically and we store everything and we really don't manage it very well. That's becoming something that is a taboo more and more in conversation in business these days, I think.
For sure.
Okay, so just a few touch points here to talk about the types of risks we're talking about. And I think the point here is just to show the diversity and breadth of the problem, because there are things like retention liability, where your record schedule may say that you retain a certain type of document for a period of X years. And that may be enforced by an industry expectation. And if you're not doing that, that represents a very real liability to your organization. Not only that, from a compliance perspective, and here if cybersecurity is an issue, then there are a host of very well-known security compliances that attestations are required in order to achieve. And I've seen more and more regularly, not only the security compliances, but information governance and compliances being something that organizations will ask about. I can think of a few cases in the last few weeks where folks have reached out to us from our European customers and said, as a result of what's happening in the Ukraine, there's a need to tighten information practices from a cybersecurity perspective. And what are you folks doing to ensure that you are reaching and able to attest to XYZ compliance regulation? And I think that's a sign of the times. Data loss prevention is an issue. Folks copying a file into their Gmail and sending that out of the organization containing sensitive information or intellectual property. Endpoint protection, being able to not only protect your devices, but devices that contain company data that don't belong to you, as well as endpoints that are spread across various branches as well as the cloud. Insider risk management, that is again what are the chances that folks who are inside of the organization can disintermediate your information? And I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm sure Brian and Jay may have a few items they'd like to pick out here, but things like identity and access risk, is particular. Yeah, go for it, Brian.
Yeah, so I was actually going to pick up right where you were jumping in there. Identity and access risk. We talked to a lot of organizations that now, fortunately, at least have a 2FA or MFA process in place to ensure that users are logging in from where they say they are, or we're confirming it's the actual user who's attempting to access the sensitive workplace, the digital workplace in which they're collaborating. So that's an important one to consider if your organization does not have 2FA or MFA in place, not even just inside the Microsoft Azure AD world, but if you're using other platforms like Okta or other SSOs out there, to ensure users have the secure access and ensuring that only the right person is accessing your workloads, and you don't have what's called an impossible situation where users in Nigeria or another part of the world where they've never actually been before. Same thing with the social and human element, being able to help minimize the risk of somebody attempting to engineer access through somebody who could be influenced through either a message or something else questionable like that. Those are the risks we're talking about here. So it's both an application layer, as I mentioned earlier, and also a human layer here as well. And IT teams and security teams need to definitely focus on both in order to be successful.
Yeah, and I've often seen that, an organization can spend a lot of money putting in place firewalls and endpoint protection and have conditional access and all of those things in place. And it only takes one person to click on a link and essentially, expose the company's data as a result of a moment of not thinking about what they were doing. And it's for that reason that security monitoring is also very important, because being reactive is no longer acceptable. In order to be proactive, folks have to be able to have their finger on the pulse of the organization. In the same way, it would be ridiculous if you went to the hospital and they didn't hook you up to any machines to look at your vital signs, and yet they were trying to medicate you. It's expected that you should be able to plug certain things into the organizational body, if I can put it that way, in order to take a pulse, in order to ensure that you understand what the different levels of health are for your environment. And that's why I think folks are starting to lean more and more on things like artificial intelligence to pick up trends inside of that security data that human beings may not spot easily.
For sure.
Okay, next one. Okay, so interesting slide here. This is really just to kind of give an indication of the type of information liability that we're talking about. And here, I suppose what we're trying to drive home is that the risks are real. And we're seeing highly publicized cases of very large companies that are attracting massive fines for breaches of data security, data privacy, mismanagement of information. And these are examples from across the globe, but I think you had a good point to make when we were chatting about this, Brian, about the fact that organizations that are global can attract multiple fines.
Absolutely, that we see, because some of these ones that are listed here were specific to a country like the United States or the European Union, but things like Equifax, they're a global organization. So they not only dealt with fines in the United States, they also had to deal with the legal proceedings and the fines imposed upon them by the European Union, by Canada, by Japan, and other countries that have that Equifax had a presence in. And so we see this a lot with organizations, that there's this knock-on effect. It's not just about what could happen to your data inside the United States, but globally, because the connections are are intertwined between the various data centers in which we all work. So it's something to consider as a part of the cost of doing nothing, right? That not only would we, potentially have risk here for our content in North America, but also for, other parts of the organization that might work with a European arm or an APAC arm or another part of the world where these restrictions are in place.
Yeah. And some of the stats on the right-hand side talk to a survey that was done a while ago that found that, in organizations today and in this day and age, and despite what we're seeing from a cybersecurity perspective, there are still a lot of companies that have a very high percentage of non-expiring passwords over large numbers of accounts, where there are multiple, or if not dozens, of administrators, where employees have access to sensitive files no matter what their role is in the organization. And these are the types of things that folks want to try and tackle. And the fact is, if we're talking about information governance, that the first step is to know what the information is and what to protect and where it sits. And those are not always easy things to do. A lot of folks kind of just know that they have 5 terabytes of information that they need to protect, and they can't tell you within that 5 terabytes what is business critical, what is redundant, obsolete, or trivial, and what is not likely to ever be used again.
Indeed. So it's something to always consider as an organization grows in its footprint in the cloud, is that those legacy aspects of how things were done historically on-prem, or how things were done previously before we got into cloud services.
Yeah. Okay, so this slide is just some information around the stringent, the enforcement and the regulation and the levels thereof. And I think a few years back, as little as 5 years, 10 years back, this was a very different picture. But you'll see that most of the globe is now either at the heavy or otherwise at a robust level. And certainly the first world is at the level where there is an expectation that certain regulations must be adhered to. We see that from the fines. And some of the things that I think are interesting from the information that we use to compile this slide is things like the fact that it's not only important to have the attestations to meet certain compliances, but that you are actively advertising the fact that you meet those compliances as well, because it is becoming more and more important to be seen to be compliant and due diligent in the way that you manage your information, rather than this being something that's filed away at the back of the filing cabinet that you haul out at audit time and never think of again. A lot of organizations are representing these compliances in their proposals, in their contracts, on their home pages, to show that they're serious about information management.
Yeah, and what you just said there, Ryan, which I really appreciate, is the way that these regulatory frameworks are operating now, and regardless of the country, because eventually at some point you will do business with an entity based in a country that has to comply with these, you have to also, by proxy, as a vendor or a customer of that organization, do the same framework of say it, do it, improve it, with that same framework in mind. So these things are increasingly encroaching not just in the European Union or North America. There's something that impacts all businesses, because all businesses will be responsible for data stewardship going forward.
Yeah. Okay, then a couple of slides here about information governance. This one has to do with the fact that information governance is an organization's coordinated interdisciplinary approach to satisfying information compliance requirements and managing information risks while optimizing information value. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but the 3 points to take away here are that, number one, it's about informational legal requirements, first off, that there are information related risks, either as an extension of those requirements or otherwise risks that are inherent in the fact that there's intellectual property that represents the way that an organization does business. And then further than that, that there's also value to be derived in information governance, that properly managed information results in value to the organization, because information can be reused, because information is available in order to make business decisions. And these are the types of levers that we're talking about when we're talking about information governance, as a way of managing risk when we're talking about data.
For sure, and to build on top of this too, the one thing we're seeing a lot of organizations talk about now is not only the historical footprint, but the rapidly expanding footprint of content that is proliferating in most data repositories in the cloud. Organizations are starting to hit ceilings really quickly with the cost of storing information that they don't have context over. So we're starting to see a lot of IT teams, a lot of security teams starting to put pressure on the business to be better data stewards to start this conversation around data governance. You've used this one many times, and I've taken it to my own conversations as well, Ryan. Do we need to hold on to the lunch form from 2012, or can we actually dispose of that properly because it's no longer relevant information to how people work today? So thinking about this when it comes to information governance is also starting to talk to the business about their responsibility for the content they create.
Yeah.
And Brian, just to kind of add on top of that, right, there's something that we just talked about with a customer the other day that I thought was very interesting. They were talking about moving all of their content from one environment to another, but they were struggling to understand how could they best take the data that was most pertinent and relevant, process it initially prior to moving it into M365, right? So for them, they were struggling to even understand what was critical, what actually needed to be used, what needed to be maintained, and even why. Understanding that tools out there are going to allow you to do this digital transformation without you having to pre-qualify the data is massive, right? So ensuring that you have the right tools for the job also makes a big difference for a lot of folks that I think some people don't always think about.
You're right. And then being able to build into that, Jay, how do we present that to the business in a way that they can make a good decision over what is valuable information or not?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I saw a stat, and I think we've used it in our slides previously, that says that business critical information normally comprises 12% of an organization's total data. So that's a staggering figure if you think about the fact that folks are paying to store the rest of it and paying to secure the rest of it, when such a small percentage of it really has critical business value.
Exactly. Good stuff.
Okay, so when we talk about approaches to information governance, we alluded to the fact that there's three levers that kind of steer us here: compliance, risk, and value. We're either looking at meeting compliance, and I would say that in most cases we see that folks are doing that grudgingly. Regulation X, Y, Z, we have to meet it. It's going to cost us money to get there, but we have to get that compliance accreditation because it's expected from our partners, it's expected from our customers. The other one is risk, and that is generally done reactively. We have dealt with many organizations where we've identified a risk and the organization has said, we acknowledge the risk, but we're not going to do anything about it. And in some of the cases, at a later stage, that risk has ended up being a reality where there has been a liability that was identified, nothing was done about it. And now there's a court case that's been opened up and there's a loss of customers as a result of the fact that you as a vendor, for instance, have not due diligently maintained the information that you needed to, and that you've maintained stuff outside of what you were needed to do from a regulation perspective. And it's at that stage, reactively, that we see a lot of folks try to then wrestle with information governance to stop it from happening again. And the third one, which is let's implement information governance for the value it will bring the organization, for the productivity it will bring to people, for the fact that we can find and reuse information in a better way, for the fact that we can reduce our storage costs and we can reduce our security bill because we're protecting less information. And surprisingly, I think that implementing information governance for the value side of things is something that we sparsely see. And that surprises me, and hopefully that's something that's changing over time, because I really think that having an organized house in terms of the way that you manage your information with policy just makes business sense.
I love this point, Ryan, because we run into customers who struggle with this all the time. I make reference to, missing the forest through the trees here with the sheer amount of data that they have to start parsing. And just even thinking about on this page in this slide here with what's presented, that you have, 3 different frameworks to start thinking about segmenting your data. That, as you mentioned earlier, in that statistic, about 12% of all data actually has, true continuous value after it's been consumed, created, or used. That falls into that third column there, but everything else can fall into a specific bucket to help you start segmenting your data, because even in the workspace world of M365 with Teams, SharePoint groups, OneDrive, Exchange, etc., there are certain areas where there will be valuable information, But again, helping your users think about how to parse through this, you can actually say or work with them on these frameworks about how to actually fit this into what is valuable versus what is, at risk or risky information, or even what they need to keep for compliance purposes. And that's a great framework to think about here.
Yeah, I think that's
Oh, no, go ahead.
Jay. I was going to say, I think that's a really great point, because you don't need to identify that pesky lunch menu from the cafeteria 5 years ago individually and go and hit the delete button on it. In order to get out the gates with information governance, you can just start with broader buckets. You can start by saying, let's paint our information with one of 3 brushes: compliance, risk, value, or redundant, obsolete, and trivial, or business critical. And just try to get to a point where you're able to manage things in a better way at a higher level before you start to drill down to the more granular level. Okay, so a bit of a cheeky slide here. This has to do with carrots and sticks. So it's an extension of the discussion we've been having about compliance and risk and value, and talking about what are the positives of information governance as a way to manage risk, and what are the sticks which might beat you in that direction, as it were. And I think that some of the things here should be evident. Things like, from a carrot perspective, there are reduced costs, meaning that if you're able to identify your 12% business critical information and start to mine and get rid of the stuff that is redundant, obsolete, and trivial, you will reduce your storage costs. You will reduce your security bill. The value of information will go up. The less information you have, the higher average value that information will have. Efficiency increases when things are easier to find, when knowledge is available and we know where it is because the information landscape is organized. There are opportunities for process automation when you don't have a repository that has grown organically over 10 years. And ultimately, employee satisfaction will go up if folks feel that they spend less time finding information, recreating content, and all of these things that are big detractors from our current information ecosystem. And likewise, on the stick side of things, there is the potential for reputational damage should you mismanage PII, and should that PII get outside of your organization or be hacked. There is financial liability that could be raised for non-compliance to specific regulations. There is customer harm where you are managing information on behalf of a customer, and as a result of a hack or as a privacy leak or something along those lines, you do harm to your customers as a result of your information practices. And then there's informational costs, which we've spoken about. Information is growing at 23% per annum. So whatever the size of your problem is today, it's going to be 23% bigger next year. And that goes to informational growth as well. And I think what we're really trying to talk about here is, if you take these things and you quantify them and you think about them in the realm of a business case, you could build a business case which represents implementing information governance in order to drive down your risk and in order to make folks, more productive, generally more satisfied, with reduced costs, better efficiency, higher average value of information. You could build this business case, and it then is much more than this grudge purchase, much more than this reactive response to risk. Rather, it is a conscious strategy that you put in place that ultimately becomes a differentiator for organizations in the public sector, or something that can be modeled by other agencies if we're talking about the public sector.
And Ryan, that's a really great point, right? When we talk about the carrot component of this, I absolutely agree with you, right? Seeing efficiency is drastic, right? Having sprawl of things like Teams means that different documents that you might be collaborating with the same folks on might live in different locations. It becomes very challenging to actually find what you need in a timely fashion and ensure that the proper documents are being updated and maintained. But unfortunately, the stick really does win a lot of times, right? Especially nowadays when you think about Microsoft and their ever-changing licensing, right? So now it's going to cost you more for the same licensing you used to pay for previously. Something that people don't often think about, though, is what it actually costs them in order to store their data in the cloud. And this isn't just from Microsoft's perspective, this is also for other cloud sources as well. But something that I just heard recently, right, in a lunch and learn from Halfpoint was that one document that you might have in a OneDrive location, that one document is stored multiple times for multiple versions. So something as simple as a 10 megabyte file can easily be stored upwards of 5 and 10 gigs in Microsoft for just one document. And that's compounded by the fact that most people don't realize versioning is enabled in OneDrive automatically. So little things like that, being able to understand not just how your current data lives and how it's being maintained and how it's being structured, but also the challenges that will arise with whatever solution you're going to leverage in the future or whatever platform you're going to leverage, understanding how it's set up natively, some of the best practices around it, it can go a long way to avoiding some headaches and painful conversations regarding the cost of around data information growth.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Jay. You know, I think if you walked into a manufacturing or retail business and you walked into their stockroom and the stockroom was a mess and everything was uncategorized and lying all over the place, not only is that a reflection on the type of service that you're likely to get, but it's also a reflection on the culture of the organization. And I think that we're getting there from an informational perspective as well, because what we're talking about is housekeeping, understanding what goes where, understanding what size it is, understanding how much storage space we have in that stockroom, and understanding how we manage it effectively. Okay, so a list of some considerations, hopefully to prod the good folks on the call and to give you some hints at what you should be thinking about if you're going to pursue some avenues of information governance and information compliance and some of the things that help you understand and reduce risk inside of your ecosystem. Things like data retention and preservation. Data retention is something we've dealt with a lot in the public space and is, you know, federally mandated and expected, but it's no longer just the realm of the public sector and highly regulated industries like healthcare and education and the financial sector. Almost every organization has to have some kind of policy that shows how long it intends to retain certain types of information, and then an operational framework that will help them to maintain that and to ensure that that's what actually happens inside of the different business units that make up that org. And that leads on to electronic record keeping. And this is a hot topic at the moment with organizations like NARA, who are now no longer accepting physical records. Well, I think it's at the beginning of this year, if I'm not mistaken. And that really means that folks are having to look at digitizing and how to manage electronic records and how to then submit that to archival organizations like NARA. The management of privacy and PII, and we've touched on this a number of times already in these slides. Data security, which is the hot topic and what everyone loves. And a lot of times when we talk to folks about compliance, they immediately go to security compliance, SOC 2 compliance. You know, are we encrypting everything at rest and in transit and that is certainly a component of this, but it's not the biggest component of this, and it's also not, you know, if you spend all your money on data security, you're going to have significant holes in your information ecosystem as a result of all the other pieces which may be, you know, waiting on the side of the road, as it were. And then data protection, how to ensure that sensitive information doesn't leave your organization. The obligations of litigation, where if there is a legal hold, you're obliged to maintain certain information for a period of time, and how do you do that, and how do you perform e-discovery searches and those processes. We've dealt with a lot of organizations where they're doing this in an ad hoc format. We even spoke to an organization where the CIO was getting involved in e-discovery because it takes such a significant amount of time in a detailed process requiring a sensitive hand, and it's certainly a bugbear for a lot of organizations. We spoke about data. Sorry, Brian, please dive in.
All good. Yeah. So I wanted to share that I agree with your sentiment there, and I deal with a lot of organizations, and I'm sure you see this too. They're building the car as it's moving, right? And that's okay. The important thing is when talking to the business about some of these trade-offs and strategies is we have to implement on the go, right? Or as these things evolve, because M365 is not a stationary application. We see all the time, for example, in the Security Compliance Center, in Azure Active Directory, and other workloads, Microsoft is investing billions of dollars in making these solutions, updating them regularly with new features and options, so that way things don't stand still. So I think it's important for everyone to understand on this call that you're not alone, and this isn't something that is going to be stationary, that we just check a box and we're done. It's a continuous conversation like what you're showing up here, and that sometimes we're going to have to do things that are a little unusual in order to help build a process around it. But that is part of information governance as we move forward in the cloud, and this is a brave new world and a new way of thinking that a lot of organizations will have to continuously address this. And the important thing, like you have down here at the bottom, is ensuring that you have a duplication of your data in a backup format in case of a DR instance, or for example, a business process around archiving your content, so that way you can move content to less expensive storage, or having a business process that helps you segment that information. And then at the end of the day, also advocating for your end users to also be champions. And it's not just the IT team providing the infrastructure here, that they also have their responsibilities as data stewards when it comes to information governance as well. If they create it, they have to be responsible for its end of life as well.
Yeah, and I think the last point there is important as well, because, or at least very close to my heart, because we work with a lot of organizations who spend a lot of money to put in place the best IT solutions that you can expect in order to identify this risk, to manage it effectively, to exercise policies. And the fact of the matter is that people are still at the center of everything. And it's really important that folks are advocates in this journey, that their priorities are met, that they understand the benefits that they will glean from a journey in reducing risk and implementing compliance and governance, and that ultimately they become champions for pushing the plan forward, rather than victims on which the IT implementation is unleashed at the end of the day. Because certainly, the former is much better set up for success, and it means that it's an investment of walking folks through that journey, educating them, making sure that they understand the reasoning, that they are able to contribute what they think will be of value in terms of the way certain things are rolled out. And I certainly can't express more than that how important I think it is.
Indeed.
Right, so yep.
Go ahead.
So where do we start? A few points here, and these journeys generally tend to look alike. If you've watched our previous webinars, you'll see a lot of congruency with the way that we approach these types of things. And I think from an industry perspective, we've settled on a cadence for addressing things like governance and information compliance and so forth. And this should then be of no surprise. The first, if you're thinking about this and going, all right, I buy in, this is something we need to do, the world is moving in a direction, and our organization or our agency needs to move in that direction too. The first thing to do is to envision that, and to ensure that, first of all, you have stakeholders and sponsorship in order to properly get behind an information strategy that would form part of the same set of strategies that your product strategy and your IT strategy and so forth form a part of, because it's really embedded in every single thing that most organizations do these days. So the software is everywhere, and technology is everywhere, and information is everywhere, and that means that information governance strategy is everywhere. And once you have a good goal of what you want to do, and that might include things like, what is our organization's compliance goals, and what are we trying to do from a cost perspective, and what do we want to measure in terms of productivity gains for our employees. Whatever that might be, you need to form that vision, get behind it, get the sponsorship, and once you're out of the gates, the first step is to assess where you're at. How much information do we have? Where is it? Is it accessible? are the user accounts that are being used and the permissions that are being used outdated and belong to people who've left the organization? How much of that is in the cloud? How much do we want in the cloud? What does our tenant configuration look like? What does our record schedule look like? Essentially, you want to get as much information as you can to help you understand the moving parts of the information ecosystem inside your organization or agency. And then you want to think about how to enforce policies. You know, Microsoft 365 is a fantastic platform. And out of the gates, it's going to do a lot to enable productivity and high availability of information for an organization. But there's a gap in terms of how you implement specific policies. And those might be industry specific. They might be organization specific, because Microsoft tends to do things in broad brushstrokes and generalize. And so you need to think about, how do we articulate our policies when it comes to information, and how do we enforce them? And without the ability to enforce those policies, you will struggle. And then you're in a position to start to plan and say, right, how do we roll this out? How do we communicate with folks? What kind of planning do we need to do? How do we consolidate information? How do we build a foundation, perhaps on SharePoint Online, that has a site structure that mimics our organizational structure, or that looks like our the different business units that we have? And then you might find, when you get to that point, that you're going, well, actually, it doesn't make sense for us to be as fractured as we currently are. How do we consolidate certain information so that it's more manageable and centralized? And then finally, what can we do to migrate certain information to the cloud so that it is automatically highly available and we gain all the benefits of a cloud environment, even though we may elect to be hybrid for the next 5 to 10 years, which is something we're seeing and is totally normal for most orgs. And any thoughts here, Jay or Brian? No.
Yeah. So, because just being mindful of time, because we do have 1 or 2 more slides, I'll speak to this one pretty quickly, Ryan. So, just thinking about this maturity model from the 0 to 11 here, we find organizations are actually quite all over the board, depending on the department, who they're engaged with, and at the same time, the thought leaders in the organization about how to think about the cloud and what they want to use it for. So, we find quite a few customers here between, you know, informed and enabled, and then, you know, the continuous growth and the maturity cycle here, to wanting that last step here of insightful information or insightful reports on user activity, or what's going on with the content, or what's going on with access to these things. So when you're thinking about where your data sources are, what your users are doing, and what your IT team is doing internally to ensure the infrastructure is in place, these things need to be in communication. These different elements inside your business should be in communication, or people should be advocating for that communication, so that way you can see where people are, because you'd be surprised sometimes, just over a cup of coffee, you suddenly realize that a part of the business you thought had picked up on a certain concept or is following a business process a certain way may not be. So it's one of those things, as you either start heading back to the office or you start having impromptu conversations with parts of the business, it's a really important thing to understand that the business might be in multiple stages at once, and start thinking about how we can get them to move lockstep and mature together, so that way everybody can benefit from those insights.
Yeah, and it's a journey, I suppose, is the point here. Just to amplify what you're saying, right? Put first things first. Everyone wants the sexiness at the top end of that maturity scale, but it takes a lot of foundational work to get the right things in place to really enable that to work. And we often see that folks who try to enable something that is aspirational, but that it's missing some of the foundational pieces, whether they be security oriented or a properly articulated information taxonomy, whatever it might be, you know, that may end up being more of a liability than an asset to the organization.
Indeed.
Yep. All right, we've got about 9 minutes left, so we're going to speed up a little here, I think. As much fun as it is to talk to y'all.
Mm-hmm.
Maggie, we can go to the next slide.
So I think one thing that we kind of want to talk a little bit about here, right, very quickly, is just what it means from an IT governance perspective, and how Apppoint and Mint Group does actually fit into that, right? The idea being that if you ask anybody what governance is today, you're going to ask probably 5 people and get 10 different answers. So we've simplified what we call operational governance versus data governance, right? Data governance is that sexiness that everyone's talking about today, right? How we handle individual documents and items. But Brian and Ryan alluded to this earlier, that that's all well and good, but it's very challenging to start there. There's a lot of nuance to governing each individual document, each individual record. And so instead, if we focus on the operational governance perspective, right, that top level down, so all of the collaboration workspaces themselves, rather than individual items, we can actually start to approach this a little bit easier and quicker, right? So that means that your ability to actually implement a governance strategy can be a lot easier to do, because now you're focused on entire workspaces and their settings and configurations rather than individual documents. It also simplifies how we actually classify things, right? So whether it's workspace provisioning or ongoing management and lifecycle enforcement of individual collaboration workspaces, or even end-of-lifing them and figuring out what do we do once we no longer need some of this content that we've already figured out is now past its due date. All of that operational governance allows us to apply broad policies rather than individual controls. And it can really speed up the process for those folks who are trying to get into the governance without necessarily having all of some of those bells and whistles that Ryan and Brian were talking about earlier a couple slides ago.
Yeah,
In the next slide. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
Just real quick comment, just that the important thing on this slide that Jay spoke very well to is just helping you think about how to segment this from a strategy standpoint into 2 effective tactics. You know, the operational governance around the application itself, and then the broader conversation with the business around the data governance and making everybody responsible as a data steward. That's what we're talking about here fundamentally, and Jay did a great job explaining that here, but we can go ahead and move forward.
So a real world application of this, right, from that operational governance standpoint, if you were to use a tool like Apppoint's cloud governance solution, what you'd end up finding is that we're able to put controls in place, right? So giving you the tools necessary to enable your power users and your end users with what type of workspace do they need and what type of settings should go along with that workspace. This ensures that they don't have to be admins to an environment. They don't have to know all the nuances, the ins and outs, right? All they need to know is what type of workspace do I need to create, and what are the settings and configurations that are associated with that will be automatically applied at the time that they create that workspace. So if they go through and fill out a form for a specific department, right, that department A, for example, might not have external sharing enabled because there's a lot of PII in that environment and in the data that they work on. Consequently, it means that we have to have expiration and retention periods around this particularly sensitive type of collaboration workspace. It also means that we need to figure out how these users are going to be able to create this collaboration workspace, right? So all of this might have to go through a central IT team. But after a period of time, right, so we may not have hit that 6-month mark yet where we need to delete it or remove it or continue access, but during the middle, right, so maybe 3 months in, we need to recertify the members. We need to ensure that the folks who still have access to this data should still have access. Putting this into place is the type of activities that you're going to be able to do with operational governance that will help mitigate some of those needs for the granular controls and kind of ensure that it's a little bit easier for you to break into governance as a whole without simultaneously having to figure out what each individual department is doing from a business standpoint.
Right, and just to build on this real quick, the ability to also give exceptions, or the ability to build to how the business works rather than imposing a general rule that everybody must follow, because I'm sure everybody in every organization can find an exception to any rule that an IT team would want to impose. So finding ways to allow for flexibility and dynamicism in your governance policies and strategies is really what Jay is bringing together here. And it's a lot of really great points about how to do those things with the different parts of the organizations going forward as you mature in your governance, operational governance policies, and then the data governance aspect as well.
Okay, and then just in conclusion here, this is another way of looking at the same information that we've been talking about in terms of how you segment your data information strategy and how you look at that and how you prioritize compliance, risk management, and governance. And you'll see a lot of these types of frameworks circulating on the internet as folks try to wrestle with this problem. And essentially what this is talking about is that the impact of non-compliance is going to drive two discussions. One is going to be about compliance, talking specifically about regulations that have to do with security, information management, privacy, all of those types of things. And the organization as a whole needs to have a body that can make decisions about how to document these types of compliance requirements and make a decision about how an organization or an agency is going to comply with these. And then on the other side of that coin, there is risk management, which is identifying then, and one of those risks will be the risk of non-compliance to those regulations, but also looking at the weight of cost and what is that as a risk, and the volume of data and the need to secure it, and what does that impose as a risk, and so forth and so on. And essentially those two elements, documenting how you measure, how you identify, and how you report back on risk, and how you are going to structure your compliance requirements internally, will feed into a governance program. And it's really here that the rubber meets the road, because if you are unable to take these policies and operationalize them, then they're going to fail. And we've dealt with a lot of organizations where they have a really great compliance policy and a really good risk management sheet, a risk sheet, or something that they maintain month to month and circulate amongst leadership. But if you can't translate that into an operational framework for enforcement, it will fall flat. Okay, so in conclusion, roaring in at the finish line here, we have an analysis survey that anyone who is on the webinar and has been kind enough to join us and make it to the end is free to sign up for. It is completely free. It's fast. It's fun. It's full of facts. So go ahead and take a look. What it will do is ask some leading questions to help you assess your level of maturity at a very high level within your agency or organization, and give you some indicators of where you might be able to pick some low-hanging fruit or otherwise seek assistance in addressing your information journey and roadmap.
All right, thanks so much everybody for coming. Remember, if you have any questions after the fact or as you're watching the recording, please email us and I will forward those questions on to the guys and get those questions answered for you. Thank you so much, guys. Great job as always. And we'll see y'all next month.
Thank you, Maggie. Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Brian.
You're welcome. Thank you, team.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.